Hello, AP Environmental Science students. Today we're going to continue talking about Chapter 4, which is Biodiversity and Evolution. All of today's notes are based off of Living in the Environment, the 16th edition by Miller and Spoolman. So, Chapter 4, Section 2, focus is where do species come from? So there's two main ideas here. The first of which is the scientific theory of evolution explains how life on Earth changes over time through changes in the genes of populations. The second big idea is that populations evolve when genes mutate and give some individuals genetic traits that enhance their ability to survive and to produce offspring with these traits. This is called natural selection. So, biological evolution by natural selection explains how life changes over time. Again, a lot of this section is review from biology. So if you had me last year, great. If you had bio 2 or 3 years ago, hopefully this kind of jogs your memory. So first of all, my definition of biological evolution is the process whereby Earth's life changes over time through changes in the genes of populations. Natural selection is the mechanism in which evolution occurs. So natural selection is organisms constantly struggle to obtain enough food and resources to survive. Some organisms have genetic advantages or adaptations to help them do this better. Therefore, natural selection occurs when some individuals of a population have genetically based traits that enhance their ability to survive and reproduce. So there are two people that are pretty much credited with discovering this idea of natural selection. The first, and kind of the forerunner in this whole idea, is Charles Darwin. He wrote The Origin of Species. This book was all about his observations when he was on the Galapagos Islands with his finches and their beak size compared to what they ate. At the same time that Charles Darwin was doing all of this stuff, Alfred Russel Wallace also was coming up with this same idea, so they kind of did it simultaneously, but Charles Darwin is more well known because he was the first one to actually publish this idea. So when we look at natural selection and changes from the beginning of Earth to now, we kind of show that life has evolved in this tree of life pattern. The tree of life is a theory that all life started with one unknown common ancestor and then since has evolved into 6 major groups of species as a result of natural selection. So obviously that one common unknown ancestor is from a very, very long time ago, and these branches have split off as we've gotten closer to present day. The 6 branches are eubacteria, archaebacteria, which are both types of prokaryotes. We have our protists. We have plants, fungi, and animals. So one of the big things to recognize is that evolution is a theory that generally explains how life has changed over the last 3.7 billion years. It also helps to explain why our life is so diverse today. However, it is a theory. So this means that there's a lot of unanswered questions and debates over all of the details. For the most part, however, evolution is a widely accepted theory, and if you talk to the majority of scientists, they'll say that yes, evolution is actually occurring in our planet. So most of what we know about evolution comes from the fossil record. So fossils, ice core samples, layers within mountaintops all contain fossils or evidence for us that we can use. And fossils can be mineralized or petrified replicas of skeletons, bones, teeth, shells, leaves, and seeds, or they can be impressions of those things found on rocks. Fossils provide our physical evidence of what ancient organisms look like and what the internal structures were like. However, we only think that we are seeing through these fossils about 1% of the species that actually lived. This means that our fossil record is very incomplete and what we know about the past is pretty sketchy. So, we're going to go into a little bit more about what natural selection is and how it actually works. And the main idea behind, or the main push behind natural selection are genes. So, The process of evolution by natural selection involves changes in a population's genetic makeup through successive generations. So the big idea here is that populations evolve, not individuals. So that kind of goes by a stepwise process. So step one is to have genetic variability developed through mutations. And mutations are just random changes to the structure or number of DNA molecules that a cell has that can be inherited by offspring. So mutations can be caused by random changes, mistakes when we're replicating our DNA, or they can be caused by mutagens, which are things like X-rays, radioactivity, chemicals, think like cigarette smoke or sunbathing in a tanning bed. That can cause things like skin cancer. So those things all cause mutations. Step two is where sometimes a mutation gives an organism an advantage to survive. So these advantages are called adaptations or adaptive traits. And the definition of this is that it's any heritable trait that enables an individual organism to survive and or reproduce more than other individuals in their current environmental conditions. Adaptations must be heritable. So if they're not something that's stored in their genetic information that can be passed down to the next generation, it is not considered an adaptation. For example, and this is going to be a dumb example, but if I dyed my hair red and that made me more likely to find a mate because I dyed my hair, that is not an adaptation that I can pass on to my offspring. So therefore, it would not be considered a true adaptation. Adaptations also have to lead to differential reproduction, which basically means that some members of a population are more likely to mate and have offsprings than others. This includes things like genetic resistance or antibiotic resistance when we're talking about bacteria. Genetic resistance is just the ability for one or more organisms in a population to tolerate a chemical designed to kill it. So when you get sick, you take an antibiotic. Antibiotics are designed to kill that bacteria that is infecting you. However, bacteria can evolve to have antibiotic resistance, which means that when you take that antibiotic, it won't kill them anymore. When environmental conditions change, populations have three choices. They either have to adapt to new conditions through natural selection, like I just described. They can migrate to an area with more favorable conditions to the adaptations they already have, or they die and go extinct. Humans have become a very powerful species due to evolution. And there's three major adaptations that most biologists attribute to that strong success as a species. The first of it is strong opposable thumbs, which allow us to grip and use tools better than other animals. We walk upright and we have complex brains. All three of these adaptations have helped us to develop weapons, protective devices, and technology that extend our senses and make up for some deficiencies. So technology-wise, when it gets really cold, we've developed shelters to stay in. We've developed indoor heat, coats and jackets to put on when we leave the house. So even though technology, you kind of think of like these really intense technical things, it can just be something as simple as a jacket or clothing. Adaptation through natural selection has limits. So there are two major limits to these adaptations. First, you have to have genetic change before the environmental condition ensues. So, for example, you have to have a polar bear that has a really thick coat before it turns really cold. Otherwise, if it turns really cold first, that polar bear is going to die. Even if a beneficial heritable trait is present in a population, the population's ability to adapt might be limited by their reproductive capacity. And reproductive capacity is just how quickly an organism can reproduce. So if a population needs an adaptation, and this I say carefully because we can't really choose our adaptations, but if it needs an adaptation to survive in an environment whose conditions are changing, and they reproduce very slowly, chances are they're not going to have that adaptation pop up in their population in enough time that they can actually survive. However, something like a bacteria, like we talked about with this antibiotic resistance, bacteria multiply super quickly. So if one of them develops this adaptation where they're resistant to the antibiotic, very quickly in a 24-hour period, they multiply. It can spread through the majority of the population, and they have learned how to survive in their current conditions. So there are three major misconceptions that always come up with when we talk about evolution and natural selection. First of all, survival of the fittest does not mean survival of the strongest. Fitness is not strength here. Fitness is a measure of reproductive success. So, for example, you might have, if you were in my bio class, you kind of read this comic that was survival of the sneakiest. So in this case, you had this like super strong cricket and a kind of sneaky cricket who's weak looking. The super strong cricket was able to chirp really loudly to try and attract their mate, but the sneaky cricket kind of swooped in and stole the mate while he was chirping, and the strong cricket was attracting the predators. So the strong cricket that was really able to chirp loudly got eaten, while the sneaky weak cricket was able to sneak in and actually mate with the female. The second one is organisms don't develop traits out of need or want. So mutations are random. Sometimes they're beneficial and advantageous, while others could be harmful or kind of neutral. We can't sit there and hope for a mutation to occur. Finally, there's no grand plan in nature for a perfect adaptation.